Today's focus is on political institutions' effects on conflict. It's the end of the first part of the class, the first 3 weeks out of 12, in which we focus on defining our key terms and looking at the major explanations for civil conflict so far in the economics and political science literature. If you think about See if I can move to this next slide. If you think about the overall path diagram for the class, it represents a simplified reality that we're focusing on over the course of the 12 weeks of the semester. We're breaking the major elements of the course into three pieces. In week one, we talked about environmental factors that we're going to be focused on in the second part of the class, human security factors, how the environment affects those human security factors, and how those in turn affect conflict. And last week we focused more on looking at the various different types of human security that we're going to be covering in the class. It is a very general measure, but it captures all the different facets that humans need to be able to feel secure and productive in their life and in their society. This week we're looking at another element of human security, and that is political institutions that can shape all of our civil rights and political rights. And we're going to try to link those factors to the causes of conflict, because next to the economic capacity arguments and the greed and grievance debate that we covered last week, the political institutions' structural explanations for conflict are, I would argue, some of the more common in this literature. How does political institutions shape people's incentives for engaging in conflict, or governments' abilities to be able to repress or buy off their citizens so that they don't want to fight? And there's over the entire semester, conflict is always in the background, and this is definitely a complicated process. And once you start looking at links in this graph, I try to keep it simple and linear, in which you have environmental background structural factors leading to and affecting human security, which in turn affects conflict. And then the one direct relationship I had between environmental factors and conflict we're going to look at a bit later, but there isn't any kind of reciprocal effect in which conflict can damage the environment, like in that slide from the first Iraq War in week one, or how conflict can also reduce human security levels of development in political institutions. So this is a simplified reality, and once you start looking at the many different strands that are involved in the bigger picture, it can get a bit like Homeland, right? When you can start to see connections everywhere, and while these all are bits of the larger puzzle, it can be a little overwhelming in the beginning to try to cover all the factors. So we're simplifying reality, trying to look at the major connections, and then in your own research or in later weeks, we can start to complicate and get a more realistic picture of these connections between the major three areas that we're actually looking at. Another way of kind of visualizing this, I know in this class there's a lot of people who learn in different ways, through visuals, through listening, or through actually doing. I'm trying to incorporate all of those in the course of this class. I keep on linking back to the complicated diagram from Thomas Homer Dixon's 1999 book, which is quite influential and worth your time if you're interested in delving into this in more detail. But I think this is one of the more influential path diagrams in this area, and you can see how he puts social segmentation and weakened institutions as one of the more proximate links to coup d'etats and group conflicts and the kinds of civil conflicts we're going to be looking at over the course of this semester. So this one shows more reciprocal effects than the one in the larger diagram. But again, with the social world, a lot of these things interact with each other. We have to figure out what's in our interest to try to simplify versus maybe you're missing too much, right? You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Burundi was an example of how a lot of these different factors can intersect. So when we're talking about political institutions, some of you might be coming from a political science background, some of you might not. Some of you might have taken almost entirely environmental classes or security, and you haven't really focused on political institutions as a general kind of phenomenon. So let's start by defining our terms. So, political institution, it's always a bit lazy, but helpful to go back to dictionaries for definitions. This one is by an academic, the Encyclopedia Britannica put into their definition that I thought was useful. This definition by Sharon Gilad defines a political institution as a set of formal rules, including constitutions, informal norms, or shared understandings that constrain and prescribe political actors' interactions with one another. Institutions are generated and enforced by both state and non-state actors, such as professional and accreditation bodies. Within institutional frameworks, political actors may have more or less freedom to pursue and develop their individual preferences and tastes. Whew, there's a lot to unpack there. But the important part is the first that I put on the slide, right? That it's a set of formal rules, including constitutions. In the study of democratic and autocratic states, you'll often focus on the Constitution as the founding document and the basis for the rules, laws, and procedures that arise in a particular country after that Constitution is passed. So formal rules are typified by constitutions. They can also include procedures, interpretations of laws, and institutional instructions for actually implementing the larger constitutional mandates, which can be quite general. I spent probably a year and a half of my life coding constitutions as part of a data project when I was in graduate school. One of my first publications was describing the Institutions and Elections Project's data, which was basically going in the old days, going into the library and actually looking at paper copies of the Constitution and figuring out who has what power. One takeaway that I found from that project was that countries, whether democratic or autocratic, often have the de jure rules pretty similar in constitutions. They give rhetoric to human rights, balance of power, though in practice there's often a disconnect between that and the formal rules. But constitutions, I think, are what are the more common statements of formal rules, informal norms, or shared understandings that constrain political actors' behavior. Constitutions are only relatively short documents. Some of them could be quite long, but they still don't cover every eventuality, and a lot of interaction between the different parts of government can establish norms over time. So we're going to be coming into each more of these formal, informal, shared understandings that prescribe how political actors intersect with each other. And I mentioned in the beginning with the actions in Belarus, in the United States, and in Turkey, different actors can try to push against those norms and to try to claim more powers or try to renegotiate the powers that aren't explicitly written down in the Constitution, or say that there's new issues that the Constitution didn't take into account, that they're going to develop new ways of interpreting it to fit their needs. So yeah, that's a quite general definition. I mean, when you think of political institutions, how many can you think about, right? Can you take a second to try to think about the different political institutions that might affect you and your life? In this current unique situation, I've learned a lot about Australian political institutions at the local, state, and national level, which has been quite interesting. I am still trying to wrap my head around the similarities and differences with the High Court in Australia versus the one in the United States. People here seem to perceive the High Court as being a lot less politicized than the U.S. I think it's interesting to try to figure out how the norms and the standing of different institutions can be shaped. So courts would be one kind of political institution, legislatures, state governments, local governments, right? and informal. Can you think of any informal institutions, right, that might be involved in either providing for human security or for conflict? I'll leave it up to you. Um, there's I think when you think of political institutions, I usually think of really fancy buildings. Washington, D.C. is definitely worth your visit next time you can actually get there. You can see the Supreme Court, the Houses of Congress, the White House, or I mean, in the UK, 10 Downing Street, right? These fundamental seats of power. You usually think of physical places that people might come and go, and you might think of particular people, but often it's the institutions. You think of the buildings. You think of um, the um, the history and the patterns of behavior and traditions that have built up over time. Um, and it can be hard to kind of try to defend uh, conceptualizations of what you might think about when you think of norms, right? They're a lot harder to kind of defend. The kind of the when we're talking about political institutions in this class, I'm going to try to keep it simple. We're going to be talking about a couple of basic types of political institutions that have a lot of other decisions within them. Human Development Index, for example, included a lot of sub indicators into an overall general measure of human development and human security. Democracy, autocracy, anocracy, the types of political systems that we're going to talk about today, embedded in that is a lot of formal and informal institutions that you can try to unpack or to try to disentangle. Some people look at the taxing capacity, like the economic arguments last week, and the government institutions that are required for that. Other people might look at security sectors for defining rights. There's a bunch of different institutions you can look at. So yeah, the first lecture question. Why don't you take a second to write down what you think takes for a country to be a democracy. In the next section, I'm going to talk more about different conceptualizations of democracy, but I'd be interested to see your take about what it really means to be a democracy. Is it the sausage sizzle? Is it something about civil political rights? Is it something else that I haven't thought about or that we're not talking about enough in this class? I want to hear it. Take a break now. Put your answer in Waddle, and we'll come back and continue.